Hi, my name is Sarah, and I want to thank you for attending this Transgender Day of Remembrance Memorial. I want to thank Friendship Place, and especially my supervisor, Mr. Brendan Rempert, for making this all possible. Um, and he was just so excited when he heard that I wanted to do this presentation. So thank you, Brendan. And I want to welcome everyone who is out there and viewing this Transgender Day of Remembrance presentation. Welcome all. Last year I actually did do I'm going to call it as TDOR for short, but last year I actually did do a TDOR presentation, but I just did it for my division within the company. And my colleagues there, they were just very empathetic and very caring, and it was an audience that just made me feel so good to see how big their hearts were when I shared the people who we had lost up to that point for that previous year. And so I just want to thank all of my colleagues at Veterans First, because you guys just have the biggest hearts. It's my hope, and I actually, after I did it last year, I thought that, well, maybe I can do it for the entire company. So it's important for me that company-wide, that my colleagues in the entire organization, and including supervisors and management, who are very caring and compassionate people, to help them understand and appreciate the dire situation that transgender people find ourselves in today. It's my hope that each November 20th going forward, that there's a recognition of this date within the company, from the highest levels, and so that is my hope. And I work with some just amazing and compassionate people, so I'm very hopeful. Prior to this crisis, I was hoping to do, this TDOR Memorial, have a traditional one where you invite guests and speakers, and you invite, everyone to come in, and people like sing songs and read poetry, and we read the names of those we've lost. But obviously, because of COVID-19, we're not able to do that. I also considered doing a Zoom, something like that. But I thought this format would give people who couldn't be there this evening or on November 20th to look at this at their leisure. So I thought this would be a good idea to use this format to do it on YouTube. So I'll tell you a little bit about Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's also known as the International Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's observed in 185 cities in over 20 countries around the world. So it is something that is observed. It was founded this day in 1999 by Gwendolyn Ann Smith. She's a transgender woman. And it's to memorialize the murder of another transgender woman named Rita Hester in Austin, Massachusetts. And it's evolved from a web-based project by Smith into an international day of action. And so TDOR is, like I mentioned, observes across the world. Rita Hester was murdered because she was transgender. It was a crime of hate. Someone killed her just because of who she was. And we all understand what a hate crime is. It's a crime of violence because of who you are, whether it's your race, your religion, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. Because of prejudice and bigotry and hate, someone wants to take your life away just because of who you are. Transgender Day of Remembrance was created as a memorial for those murdered by hate crime. This year is the most deadly year on record so far for trans people who have been murdered. But even as I'm going to read the names today, that's not all inclusive, because many times when we are murdered, we are dead named, they use our old name. The police don't recognize we were trans, and sometimes our own families don't recognize that we're trans. And so we're murdered, and no one even knew that we were trans officially. So there are many, many, many more of us who have been murdered because of this hate. So the names I read to you today, that's just a minimum amount of people. And just giving you the minimum number, it's already a record of hate murders against trans people. That's how dire the situation is. But again, I thank you for being here. And I have a musical number that I would like to present right now. So if you can just relax for the next 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll put the musical number on. Again, my name is Sarah. I'm a transgender woman of color. I started my transition in the spring of 2011, and that was the first year that I attended TDOR Memorial. Um, I had no idea before I transitioned that such horrible hate existed against this community. Um, because you don't hear a lot of it on the news. The people who are murdered, even if they're murdered in your jurisdiction, sometimes the media still isn't talking about it. As an African American person, a youngster, very young in the 60s and grew up in the 70s and the 80s, I obviously knew of the history of the horrific violence against people of color, all the racism and bigotry. But in my naivety, I thought that we had made some progress since then. I didn't think that bigotry and prejudice no longer existed, but I thought that, okay, there's the 60s and all of that and all the preceding decades, centuries before that. But, in the 2000s, haven't we made some progress? But with the horrific violence against black men, and we all watched in horror what happened to George Floyd, and all the other people who have been murdered, we can question exactly how much progress really has been made, since the Civil Rights era. As I attended that first TDOR, and I realized the terrible violence also impacted trans people, especially trans women of color. Every year of those who are murdered, up to 90% of those murdered are trans women of color. That's every year, year after year after year after year. It occurs to me now that for all those years prior to my transition, as I mentioned before, I didn't know about what was happening in the community because it wasn't in the media, it wasn't being reported, and there's just no awareness of it. At the time of my transition in 2011, only 8% of Americans knew or worked with someone who was trans, just 8%. Today, that's up to 20%, which means 80% of Americans don't know anyone who's trans at all. Compare that to 90% of Americans who know someone who's gay. So they still don't know our community. And for me, Transgender Day of Remembrance is personal. It's very personal. The roots of oppression and bigotry runs deep and can touch us all, not just trans people, but it touches trans people. 3 years ago, I was touched by it, very personally. I was touched by the bigotry, the prejudice. I was forced to leave my own home where I lived for 2.5 years because of this, and escaping so that I wouldn't end up being part of TDR, of someone memorialized. That's how dangerous that situation got for me. And that was just 3 years ago. Intolerance, threats of violence, transphobia, the hard, cold reality so many of us face in this country. So for me, TDOR is not just an annual recognition to honor lost lives. It's not simply just November 20th, it's every day. As long as oppression, hatred, prejudice, and bigotry exist. It's an everyday observance. The people we memorialize today had no idea that they would be memorialized last year at this time. We're clueless, as I am. I could be memorialized next year. And I want to talk about two people who were unaware of what was going to happen to them. The first one is just a child. only 17 years old. Her name was Brayla Stone. She's a black transgender girl. She had no idea what was going to happen to her. I looked on her social media, and she had a picture of George Floyd. She's just a youngster, and she grieved with the rest of America at what happened to him. And she had this beautiful picture of him with his daughter. So she saw what happened to George Floyd. On her social media, she spoke about herself. She spoke about her life as she saw it as an adult when she got older. She's only a high school student. And she had dreams. I mean, we all must remember what it was like to be 17 years old. I mean, even me at my age, I remember what it was like to be 17. I remember what it was like when I was 17. How you have your whole life ahead of you and you're planning college or that next job, or you're just so excited at that young age. And she had a whole life ahead of her. On June 15th, which was the last entry on this one social media that I looked at, and she had this beautiful picture of herself. But on June 25th, just 10 days later, she was dead, shot multiple times, and targeted just because she was transgender. A young life taken away. The brutality against this child is too hard to comprehend, but it's important to share, to understand it, what she went through just for being trans. It's important to understand what we're fighting for. We're fighting for our children. Not only for ourselves, we're fighting for our children. Another trans woman was murdered just 3 days ago, stabbed to death. Her name was Yuneska Carey Herrera. She's a 39-year-old trans woman killed in Miami, Florida on November 17th. Not only was she a dancer and a beauty queen, and she was absolutely amazingly beautiful, but even more importantly, she was an activist in the community. She worked hard for this community, not only the trans community, but the greater LGBTQI plus community. She was fighting for our rights. But her life was taken away in a brutal and horrific way with a knife, by a murderer with a knife. Let us take a moment now for me to share the names of those who are taken from us in this video. So one moment, please. That video is heart-wrenching, and it's so emotional every time I look at it. When will we in the transgender community have our Emmett Till moment? For those of you who don't know who Emmett Till was, he's a 14-year-old child who was murdered by white racists in the Ku Klux Klan back in 1955 and 54, 55. And his mother was so horrific. Not his mother was so horrific. What I meant to say is his mother saw how horrific that was. That she, when he was buried, she had an open casket. And she wanted people to see what happened to her child. And that motivated, inspired the greater civil rights movement. A young pastor saw that, and that inspired things. That started really the modern civil rights movement. When will people in our community, or the greater LGBTQ community, or the greater American community see these horrific murders of trans people? When will our Emmett Till movement truly be here? When can we truly say that trans lives matter? Because we can't say that now. When will this epidemic of horrific hate crimes receive the media recognition that is consumed by other events by the media today? Right now, we die in silence. And most people seem not to care. As painful as this is, and even in this despair, I continue to have hope that society can change, but it won't change by itself. During the height of the civil rights movement, with all of its oppression, with all of this injustice and murder and rape towards black people, Dr. King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It bends towards justice, but we have to help bend it. Or beautiful people like those we remember today will continue to die. We can give up, and there have been times where I've felt defeated. There have. Or we can continue to increase awareness of this violence and discrimination and hate. We can make our voices heard and learn to love each other in this society for who we are. We can all, if you're not trans, you can become an ally. You can become a voice, because you should not close your eyes to what's happening. Please don't continue to close your eyes to what's happening. I like to read a poem, and I dedicate this poem to 17-year-old Brayla, and to all of those taken from us by hate. It's a poem by Robert Kennedy. It was shared along with a passionate speech at the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Indianapolis. It was shared to a large African American audience. The poem is from Bobby's favorite poet, Aeschylus. And it goes like this. And even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. Thank you for allowing me to share this presentation with you. And I am indebted. Thank you, Friendship Place. Thank you, Mr. Reppert, for providing this platform for me to share this. And I beg you all to become allies and to help us stop these horrible murders, to be a voice for us. I love you all. Thank you.